Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And I think this week will wrap up the majority of my Patreon ask, plus a few other small holdovers, and Arca, who I will cover in the next week or two. No worries there, unless something really big drops from out of the blue, and that can happen. So let's get on the pulse. So before we go any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. We're heading into the end of this year, but we got 6 projects who are on the docket. Let's go back and talk about from Aminé 2.5. So I'm guessing this is a holdover mixtape until whatever Aminé is looking to push next, where he's throwing out more pop flourishes and showcasing some of the wild creativity that has kept his career moving after his breakthrough hit. Well, in a way, this kind of is that. Chirpy synths playing off of Aminé's, pitch shifting his voice all over the place, a lot of bouncy trap grooves playing off some gentle, shambling percussion, all of which seems to play for shallow flexing that only barely obscures a lingering depression and angst that he can't quite escape or satiate, and also keeps his delivery a little bit more muted and lethargic. And while he's still funny in a low-key, witty sort of way, it's also kind of hard to escape the feeling that this should feel a little bit more fun than it is. You would think embracing more textures in pop would have led to a brighter, splashier project, complete with all of Aminé's off-kilter charm, especially as compositionally Aminé's is as sharp as ever. And while some of that is here, I kept waiting for a hook or a sharper song to really jump out of all the pop experimentation, and I gotta be honest, I kind of struggled to find one. Maybe it's because so many of these songs feel so short, barely even getting to a second verse, or how the trap elements lead to a heavier, slightly more atmospheric vibe that doesn't always flatter Aminé's energy, and that's just not counting the songs that maybe feel unfinished. Or I don't know, maybe it's the chipmunk vocals that prevented me from getting as deep into this as I would like, but this feels like a decent throwaway at best. So 6 out of 10, take it or leave it. Next up from Weg Einer Freiheit, Noktvrn. Apologies for my awful German, once again. So I actually covered this band in the very first episode of The Trailing Edge way back at the end of 2017, where I'll admit I was still very much in the process of exploring the edges of black metal, and while I liked a decent bit of what I had heard from this band, especially after translating the lyrics, I wouldn't say they varied their sound enough to really grab me, and some of the production felt really inconsistent. But hey, I did actually like it, and I'm reaching the end of the year looking for more black metal to cover, so I wanted to give this a proper shot. I'd heard some of the buzz, and you know what? It is more interesting than what I was expecting. Not just showcasing pivots outside of black metal towards slower, more atmospheric, or even progressive arrangements with touches of horns and synth, but also featuring the occasional bit of clean singing and lyrics in English on Immortal. But what you're more likely to notice here is the low end and the grooves, where even if I question how much texture they might have, though that's kind of true across the board for this band, that in general sounds way cleaner than I normally prefer in black metal, but the bass is way more prominent to underscore a lot of the tremolo shredding and some of the flat out insane drum work. And while it certainly is very distinctive in this scene, it also kind of has the feel of simply turning up the low-end presence without using it to accent the melodies as well as they really could, outside of a standout like Gegen das Licht. I mean, it's kind of a shame because such a dense and manic performance with grooves this potent should pack a lot more of a distinctive wallop than this album does, especially as, once again, I translated the lyrics. There was actually some promise here, once again. It's an album that feels like it's on the cusp of reality and slipping into nightmare, the known and the unknown, the straggling light amidst the lingering chaos of darkness. But the strain of being on that border is seeking to rend this project asunder, and eventually the protagonist will tumble into an uncertain night. But overall, this is right on the cusp of being legit excellent for me. The high points, they kick a lot of ass, and I'm not sure there's a bad song here, but a little fine-tuning, emphasis on making those thicker grooves truly stick with some texture, that could have had this in greatness. So, extremely strong 7 out of 10, but if you are into black metal, you should really check this out. Next up from Elbow, Flying Dream 1.
I picture you'd sit, blasting my wisdom with two-barreled wit.
I'll be honest, I had really low expectations for this one. That last album leading really hard into these blocky staccato grooves and messy compositions that created this sour, weirdly detached vibe that never coalesced as well as it should have, especially with some of the more socially charged content. So hearing that their newest project was leaning more into ballad territory, actually a little bit encouraging for me. This is a band that can do really well in more subtle and understated territory, and thus here, you know, honestly, I don't think this is going to be for everyone, given that, again, it is more reminiscent of the soft-focused textures that dominated their early 2010s work, and could occasionally feel a little bit tepid or underwhelming, but I actually enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. Part of this is how Elbow has embraced a lot more of the rich vocal arrangements in order to support the padded keyboards, the great piano work and the guitar lines, the gentle but very firm and textured bass grooves, and some impeccably balanced production and mastering that never oversells it. A sort of prog rock and art pop that's got a decent amount of real complexity if you pay attention to the fine details of the composition, but it never neglects the hooks. That, thanks to Guy Garvey's unique vocal timbre, will always find a way to slip into your head. I admit, a lot of this album is catchier than you might think. Now, it's also very definitely ballad heavy, kind of slow paced. It's only about 45 minutes, but if you're not into it, I can see this dragging. And that's actually why I'm kind of happy I could get into the writing this time around. Unsurprising for an album that's written in the course of lockdown, it focuses on a return to childhood memories, simpler times, a simpler, borderline dreamlike, love-struck moments, with plenty of wistful gazes towards the untold wonders beyond in the sky, paired with an unmistakably British parochial earnestness that some might find cloying for how sweet it might sound, but I actually thought it was handled pretty tastefully with a lot of understated charm. I'll admit, I was a sucker for it. It worked on me. And yeah, again, I wound up thinking this is pretty great. Probably the most I've enjoyed an Elbow album since the 2000s. Maybe a little sentimental for some, I get that, but for me, this is a light 8 out of 10. A late year pleasant surprise. I'm really happy to find this. Next up from Cody Jinks, Mercy.
Now my faith in them is gone. I don't trust my memories anymore.
I'm a little bit surprised that even if you're into the indie country scene, how quickly this album seemed to disappear from the conversation. Even if I think that Cody Jinks' material's been kind of uneven for the past 5 or so years, I was kind of excited to discover that he was not dropping not just a country album, but a metal album as well, calling back to some of his roots. And hell, I was thinking about splitting that review into its own piece, but unfortunately that middle project came by nod, feels like some pretty stock groove metal and early grunge, where the broadly sketched writing might make sense, but the vocal mix is really sloppy, the drums have no power, and as much as I think the bass lines have a lot of muscle to back up a lot of the crunchy shredding, the really muddy mix, bereft of great dynamics, and the actual compositions don't really stand out as well as they should. But alright, let's address what would be considered the primary project with Mercy, and yeah, sure sounds like a mid-tier Cody Jinks album, alright? And yeah, I'm fully aware of how that sounds, especially as it is generally pretty good. It plays to a slightly more ragged, percussive palette, but with more defined grooves, a lot sharper lead guitar, and a lot of the pedal steel melodies, and warmer production overall that doesn't have the obvious missteps of the last 3 or so albums. I think there's been some major improvements here. And you know, Cody Jinks' rich vocal timbre, it's still as pleasing as ever, even if you can tell he's taken a little bit of wear in some recent years. I was noting that as far back as 2019. And yet I'm only kind of lukewarm on this. And again, I think it comes down to the writing. I've been saying for years now that Cody Jinks' hangdog style of hard living can often feel painted in broad strokes, where you might actually be a better fit for metal, but where a little bit more detail would help add a little more meat to the larger-than-life pictures. And you'd think that for a country project that feels a little more world-weary and a little bit more introspective would have that detail. But if you've been listening to Cody Jinks in the past decade, you've heard him play this material over and over, and while there's a bit more of a stoic romanticism to a couple songs, it's not like that's new either. I guess I can respect this for being a little bit more humble, a little bit more maturity is there but in between the lines, but at least here, Cody Jinks is so deep in his niche that there's very little I need to add to this. So yeah, 6 out of 10, honestly is being kind of generous. Next up from Richard Dawson and Circle, Henki. So when I reviewed 2020 a few years back, I articulated how I wasn't quite sure that Richard Dawson's sound was clicking for me. Yeah, some of this was his unique, creaking vocal timbre, some of it was his persistently downbeat but shockingly raw sense of nihilism, and some of it was the production choices I just did not think that clicked at all. But I also have my doubts with this new project, teaming up with the Finnish progressive rock band Circle, who have been around since the early 90s and have cranked out a distressing number of albums across the past 30 years that sprawl across grunge, krautrock, metal, and even ambient music. So okay, where does Henki take us? Well, you know what? Even if I'm not quite sure it hits the highest notes from the best songs on Peasant, I actually think this might be the closest I've come to liking a Richard Dawson album all the way through. Another surprise. I'm actually a little bit startled by how many folks seem to be thrown by how weird this supposedly is. I mean, Richard Dawson may have described this project as a flora-themed hypno-folk metal album, but if anything, it reminds me a lot more texturally of the classic folk-tinged prog rock of the late 60s and early 70s. The warmer, organic bass grooves, the jangling guitar passages, they feel significantly better balanced, and they give Dawson's peculiar voice a foundation that he absolutely needs. Then the touches of glittery organic synth are a lot better blended, and there's more of a focus on delivering an actual hook amidst all the circular, cycling melodic progressions. And even if I don't really like Dawson's falsetto at all, there's something about his lilting delivery that fits this older brand of prog, similar to how he worked on Peasant. Hell, it's honestly just such a solid fit that it's kind of tough to nitpick, outside of the fact that I wouldn't really say this has the heft of proper metal beyond the very early flourishes of the genre. But you know, when it's prog rock this solid, it's really damn hard for me to care, outside of a couple compositions that do meander in some odd places, like the panting midsection of Sylphium, or the meandering back half of Methuselah, or that utterly weird synth bridge on Lily that unfortunately blends into the final track Picture, which unfortunately ends the album on a bit of a flat note for me. But that will actually take us to the content, where for an album where the title loosely translates to ghost or spirit, you might think you know exactly where Dawson's gonna go here in his downbeat, frequently depressing stylism. And Lily being the lead-off single about a haunted hospital seems to signify going exactly into that darkness. But in reality, Dawson is leaning much more heavily on the plant iconography here. A lot of living texture to the generational stories and the references to myth and legend that we tell to make sense of a larger world that's so much bigger and unknowable than fallible humans like us will ever realize, even as we study and destroy some of those plants along the way, like the lost herb of Sylphium as the most telling example. And yet I think it's that frequent presence of the wonderment of the life and of those plants that persist and give the writing a little bit of vigor here. A parallel to the spirits, perhaps, something that will never quite leave us. But either way, it's a damn great album. Definitely playing to a vintage classic progressive rock vibe, and Dawson's framing and delivery will not be for everyone, but this is a pairing that actually clicked amazingly well for me. 8 out of 10, another surprise. I really enjoyed this. Check it out. And finally, from Devin Townsend, The Puzzle and Snuggles.
Like an ocean, round devotion fills my heart,
And now we got one of the big ones, where Devin Townsend was dropping 2 projects in quick succession, with both leaning on predominantly ambient tones, with The Puzzle featuring a lot more vocals, extraneous instrumental passages and sound effects, and more of a fractured sound collage approach, and Snuggles as a shorter, slightly more comforting ambient picture. Both were reportedly inspired by both sides of the lockdown experience of 2020, and on some level you can tell, with Snuggles being very serene and relaxing, trying to find some sense of inner peace, stability, where the puzzle, it has the utterly frantic, careening feel being thrown into a cyclone of competing musical elements and voices, where making much sense of any of this is an exercise in futility. No, seriously, I was about to come here and say that despite multiple listens to this hour-plus long album, that it just kind of defeated me in terms of making any sense of it, a puzzle that I couldn't solve. But then again, if you were treating last year with a belief in coherent rationality, I'm not sure you could have got a logical answer about 2020. Now granted, my counterpoint is that a lot of last year did make a depressing amount of sense if you were aware of the long-standing political rot across the board, and it's all the more jarring that Devin Townsend doesn't get more political with it beyond some vague appeals to broadly sketched New Age enlightenment. It's certainly not as dark as Devin Townsend was indicating that it really could be, but what I find a lot more jarring here, unsurprisingly, is the execution. To put it bluntly, even if I couldn't solve it, it became a puzzle I did not want to solve. Once again, any trace of organic texture has been blasted away from the symphonic arrangements, which leave even the acoustics, the strings, the horns, and the woodwinds feeling very frail. The drums sound absolutely sterile, and the bass grooves are non-existent. Nothing here comes close to delivering a proper hook or any sense of real heaviness before fracturing into a blast of seedy, synth-inflected, kooky zaniness that without more dynamic range or any sense of compositional structure gets stale really fast. And there's also no real sense of progression or momentum over the course of an hour, which, okay, yes, that makes sense in terms of encapsulating the last year, where the madcap improvisational weirdness, it's the point, and you're clinging to whatever routine you can find. And I know that to Devin Townsend's diehard fans, his exploration of a more scattered, deconstructive approach to composition, it can feel like a cool experiment, maybe even a callback to DevLab, one of his experimental projects in the mid-2000s. And you know, if you pay attention to the details, there are some compositional touch points where you can loosely sketch to where Devin Townsend's focus was, specifically the references to podcast, healing from trauma. But I don't know, when you sacrifice your underrated compositional tightness to go for something like this, and there's enough production issues to make it feel like a total headache, and yet as of yet we don't have the visual component that's kind of required to pull all this together, I'm just not sure there's much replay value unless you're trying to solve the album. Now, whereas for an ambient project, Snuggles is trying to do exactly what it says in the title. Give you a warmly atmospheric major chord feeling of new age comfort and peace. On a cushion of shimmering, half-heard vocals, fluttery keys, rich strings, very gentle percussion, the occasional splash of reverbed electric guitars, and a smattering of woodwinds. Honestly, even beyond my growing fondness for ambient music, I actually did like this a fair bit more in terms of sonic balance, the transitions, the flow of it all. Even if it does feel a little busier than you might like if you like ambient music, including containing a few actual groove passages, all the while still lacking in texture, with more focus on saturating the mix rather than using a lot of the negative space within it. So no, it's not the follow-up to Casualties of Cool that I would love to hear Devin Townsend make at some point. Closer parallel might be Ghost, I think. But you know what, it still is quite pleasant, if not particularly striking within ambient music. At least that's what I've heard this year. So for the puzzle, honestly, if there is an album where rating it is functionally pointless, I'd say it's here, but I'm gonna say it's a 5 out of 10. Snuggles get a solid 6 out of 10 for being a little bit better, but I won't lie, said I was a little bit disappointed for the wait for all this. Just a lot, and it didn't add up to more than the sum of its parts. Just saying. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be more than grateful. Again, we're heading into the year end here. I got a couple more albums to polish off, plus all 4 of Arca's projects. That's going to be fun. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to potentially join my Discord, help support the channel, or hey, in the next year, maybe add some albums to my schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated to. It's the holiday season. I understand if things are tight, but hey, if you've got the option, you can do it. It's available. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.